Debate. The honourable member for Courtenay-Alberni.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be splitting my time, Mr. Speaker, with the member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Mr. Speaker, it's an honour to join this emergency debate. If I seem a little tired, it's because I came in this morning on the red eye, and it's 11:25 p.m. here. So, but I would never miss this opportunity to speak and bring a message from the people of Courtenay-Alberni about how concerning this issue is, because clearly it's the most important issue, not just for people in my riding and our country, but globally. Mr. Speaker, the recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is an urgent call to action on the most serious threat facing our planet, global climate change. Thousands of scientists and experts from around the world warn that if major and unprecedented action is not taken immediately, it will no longer be possible to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and the consequences will be devastating for people and ecosystems across the globe. Mr. Speaker, Canada is failing to meet even our own modest emissions and reduction targets. And now the IPCC is telling us that our current emissions must be cut by 45%, Mr. Speaker, in order to stave off disaster. This is serious. And after a summer of soaring temperatures, rising floods and raging wildfires in my home province of British Columbia, Canadians are already feeling the impacts of climate change. And if we fail to act now to fight climate change, the cost will be immense. Families losing homes and property in extreme weather events, farmers losing crops, and all Canadians losing species and the ecosystems that make up our natural heritage. And Mr. Speaker, this is real. The PBO budgeted that it would cost us about $1 billion a year, the impact of intense storms and intense weather. And we know that it's supposed to accelerate to about $5 billion by 2020. That's only 2 years out, Mr. Speaker, and could be upwards of nearly $50 billion by 2050. I mean, we're accelerating not just fiscal debt and shouldering that to future generations, but we're shouldering them with a huge environmental fiscal debt, Mr. Speaker, and we need to be much more responsible. The world scientists have stated clearly and firmly that we must take bold and immediate action, Mr. Speaker, to ensure a safe and sustainable world. Canadians expect more from all of us, and they expect us to come together to address this issue, which is why we're here today. And it's really important that we work together on finding solutions. And I think about some of the things that we might be facing if we're in a world where global warming has reached 2 degrees above pre-industrial times, Mr. Speaker. The Arctic Ocean could be free of sea ice in the summer. It could be once per century if we're at 1.5 degrees Celsius. But compare that with once per decade if we're at 2 degrees Celsius. And we look at our coral reefs, Mr. Speaker, we could see them decline between 70 and 90% at 1.5 degrees of the global temperature. Virtually all, 99%, would be lost with the global temperature at 2 degrees. That's something that we should all be very nervous about. Mr. Speaker, I think about my own community in Port Alberni. We have seen 300-year floods in the last 4 years. We've seen huge floods in Alberta, and like I mentioned earlier, the fires raging across British Columbia and Alberta in the last couple of years. We had a drought in 2014 where we were worried about our salmon making it up our streams. We could have lost several species, Mr. Speaker, in salmon, and our salmon are struggling. Every day and every year we're hearing the challenge that they're fighting to get up our streams as warming temperatures are warming our rivers and making it more difficult for our salmon, specifically our sockeye. We talked about the forest fires, Mr. Speaker. You could barely breathe in my riding, yet there's still some people that actually don't believe that climate change is real, that our impact is real. You couldn't breathe for almost 2 weeks. It was like smoking 5 cigarettes a day is what the medical health officer compared it to. Yet some people are still not awake that this is real and that there's a sense of urgency. Ocean acidification has happened in our riding. And as my colleague from Quebec talked about earlier, we've had our worst year in 50 years in terms of weather affecting agriculture, including in my riding. When we look at what the other political parties have done in the past, the Conservatives, they muzzled scientists, they attacked environmental organizations, and they lacked the courage and commitment that was necessary to tackle this very important issue. They ran huge environmental deficits, and this is a party that runs on a platform of being fiscally responsible, yet they leave huge deficits for future generations to clean up. The Liberals ran with two major promises. One was going to be to tackle climate change, and the other was on electoral reform. Clearly, they've broken both promises, Mr. Speaker. And I talked about earlier the minister in June of 2016. I asked her in this House why she didn't follow through with her promise to end subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. Instead, what she chose to do was to go out and support her cabinet and her government's purchase of a leaky pipeline, Mr. Speaker. So not only did they not follow through with that promise, but they went the other direction. And it's very concerning because they believe that we need to own a pipeline to tackle climate change. And Mr. Speaker, where I live, no one's buying it. And we can look to countries where they've taken real action. Sweden and the UK. You know, Sweden, they've grown their economy, Mr. Speaker, by 50% and reduced emissions by 25%. We know the track record's very similar in the UK. And, Mr. Speaker, we need bold action. I remember when Al Gore came to Victoria in 2007, and he said, we need bold action. We need to make sure that, you know, it's great, he said, all of you recycling and riding your bike and doing all these great things, and you can make an impact. But he said, but 90% of it is going to be the corner cutters, big industry, the huge emitters. We need regulations to actually curb their emissions and incentives to help invest in clean energy. And he was right, Mr. Speaker, and I'll give credit to the opposition party in British Columbia, the Liberal government, because they brought in a carbon tax, Mr. Speaker, because Gordon Campbell was there. He was with me there listening to Al Gore, and he agreed with Al Gore that we need leadership. And so I commend him for that. But we need that kind of leadership right now, but even accelerated more. If we're going to reduce emissions by 45%, we need urgent action, Mr. Speaker, and we can do it. We can invest in geothermal and solar and wind, like other countries are. And electrification, I'm here with my colleague. We're the only party that has an electrification critic, where we can try to create an electrification grid across the country and be energy efficient and really, really help support electric vehicles and moving away from fossil fuels. We need to work with local government and First Nations so that you know, we can help them accelerate issues. And my friend from Pontiac talked about cycling, and I appreciate his work too on cycling. And my bill C-312, it's so that the government creates a plan. We actually need a plan with targets to grow cycling in our country. It's one of the very small initiatives, but 95% of municipalities voted in favour of it, and this government still hasn't honoured that commitment. They're just asking for a simple strategy and some funding so they can actually target something that they can help with. But we know there's many different ways, Mr. Speaker, that we can address this issue, but it comes down to urgency and us taking action. And, you know, I was fortunate to have constituents of mine sending me messages, and one of them actually was on Friday. I was doing business walks in my community, and I met Tyler Cody, who owns Osprey Electric, and he's a contractor that specializes in solar and energy efficiency technologies. And he really wants to contribute. He knows that if people have an incentive, they will purchase solar energy. You know, a small incentive will accelerate things like 100-fold, Mr. Speaker, if we can get some incentives out to individual homeowners who want to participate, who want to join in this fight to tackle climate change. And his manager, Brian Pascal, sent me a note, and quote, he says, Canada is one of the only advanced countries where the federal government offers no incentives for renewable energy implementation at either the commercial or residential level. This means no programs providing low-rate or zero-rate interest loans, no tax rebates or tax credits. Business and homeowners who want to adapt are on their own. It's a bit embarrassing, really, end quote, Mr. Speaker. And this is what he's saying. He's saying that a little bit of help would go a long way. And, you know, John Stanton just sent me a note on Facebook, and he said, we need to mobilize. People are at risk now, not 20 years from now. He wants us to get started, Mr. Speaker, and he doesn't want us to waste any more time. And Claire Schumann from Parksville says policies are not helpful if they're not put into action. Instead of focusing on the pipeline that was bought, immediate attention must be paid to reducing our carbon footprint. No more waiting. Mr. Speaker, that's what people in my community are asking for. That's what First Nations are asking for. They're asking for the government to be bold to be courageous, to not wait. That's why we're having this emergency debate. I hope that the government, in the next coming days, before the big meeting in December, will come forward with bold proposals, accelerate their plan, come back with some clear targets that are measurable, Mr. Speaker, because we need to take this seriously. It's for our children, Mr. Speaker, and the future of our planet and our ecosystem. We have everything at stake.
Bravo.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I applaud the member for his passion plea for climate change and for us to take action on this for not only today but future generations. But I was struck in his speech, and it may have been an error. He seemed to be worried about our deficit and, in fact, suggesting we were leaving that to future generations. When I suggest to him we're investing in actually climate change actions by investing in LRTs across this country. In fact, in my riding alone, the LRT Green Line, which will take 8,000 cars off the road. And I'll correct my good friend from Saskatchewan, or from Fort Saskatchewan, Sherwood Park. His government actually promised it in 2011 election, Mr. Speaker. They forgot to drop off the check. That's why we ensured after 2015 we are investing in this project, the LRT Green Line. In any event, my question for him is, can the member not see that these investments in the LRT and our national housing strategy and all of these things that we're encompassing around climate change action are real, and that our deficit is going towards fighting climate change as well?
Honourable member for Courtenay-Alberni.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the comments from my colleague from Calgary. He talked about the national housing strategy. It's a rollout where 90% of it's after the next election, over 10 years. That's not urgency. That's not action, Mr. Speaker. That's not what people need right now that are homeless, for example. This is the same way they're approaching this challenge with climate change. They're talking about all these investments. They're investing in the oil industry, Mr. Speaker. That money could be invested in clean energy. That'd be a better place for it. If they're really serious about it, Mr. Speaker, they'd end fossil fuel subsidies to the oil industry. They'd accelerate investments into the clean energy economy, and they'd get it back through jobs, through inspiration, through mitigating the impacts of climate change, Mr. Speaker, creating a healthier, cleaner environment for everyone. Everybody wins. Our health gets better, it lowers our health costs, it's fiscally responsible. So I'm actually talking about us being more fiscally responsible with us accelerating money and investments in clean energy, Mr. Speaker, and taking on this really important challenge.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Foothills.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for his speech. He always does an excellent job at his presentations and interventions. And I just, we will disagree on a lot of policy ideas when it comes around how we address climate change, and certainly the carbon tax would be one of them. But I do agree that when we want to address GHG emissions, and our goal, I think, is a cleaner climate and healthier communities. But I think we could, and I would ask if my colleague would agree, would exempting the largest emitters in industry from the carbon tax and in putting the full burden of that on average everyday Canadians, small businesses, farmers, ranchers, exempting the largest emitters industry from a carbon tax, would he agree that that is the wrong direction to take if your goal is to address GHG emissions?
For Courtenay-Alberni.
And I appreciate my colleague for his hard work and for always bringing forward a good discussion and good debate, and in a respectful way. Mr. Speaker, I think when it comes to how we price carbon and look at polluters, we need to make sure that all polluters are paying their fair share. Absolutely, the largest polluters should be paying their fair share. And, when we've looked at policies like in British Columbia, it hasn't been on the backs of lower-income people and the middle class. It's actually been something that people are excited about. We have one of the fastest-growing economies in the country, Mr. Speaker, and we've also taken leadership on reducing the impact on the environment. And we look to Sweden, like I talked about earlier, and countries around the world like the UK, where they've implemented similar, but actually much higher carbon taxes and invested them in clean energy and in jobs, and their economies soared while they've reduced emissions. So I think we need to take an approach that drives the economy, lowers emissions, and I would have appreciated tonight in this debate to hear more solutions offered by the Conservative Party, Mr. Speaker. I didn't hear a lot of presentations from the Conservative Party about how they're going to try to move forward with tackling climate change. We didn't see it, obviously, in the 10 years under Stephen Harper, and we'd expect that they would come today with some answers, with some solutions, so that we can have a healthy debate, because this shouldn't be partisan. This should be about us working together on finding solutions, because our children and our grandchildren and the future of this planet deserve it, Mr. Speaker.